Hello and welcome to PFF Wire. I'm Doug Kyed. Brad Spielberger off today, but I've got fantasy analyst for PFF, Nathan Jahnke, the great Nathan Jahnke. Nate, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm doing well too. It is Friday afternoon. We are getting you guys set for the weekend with fantasy lineups, talking about injuries. But first, I did want to talk about the Patriots running back situation. It's always fun as a fantasy analyst to dissect the Patriots running back situation, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Always fun. The preseason, they kept on changing what they were doing even then. And now week one was something, week two will be something different.
Yeah, Ty Montgomery played basically the entirety of the week one game against Miami Dolphins. Didn't seem like the injury that he suffered during the preseason was limiting him, but then he was placed on injured reserve this week. And based on what I'm hearing, Rhamondre Stevenson expected to take over that third down role in the Patriots offense. Obviously, has been filled by guys like Kevin Falk, Shane Vereen, James White in the past. Certainly looked like it was going to be Ty Montgomery to start the season, but I think this Montgomery injury, obviously you don't want injuries to anyone, but it does kind of clear up the situation here in New England a little bit fantasy wise, right?
I would certainly hope so. We saw in the last 2 weeks of the preseason, rather than rotating by situation like they typically do, they were rotating by drive. So we got to see both Damian Harris and Rhamondre Stevenson see work on third downs. My only concern is if J.J. Taylor gets activated from the practice squad. He took third down snaps in their first preseason game. And if he's on the active roster, that just complicates the situation again.
Definitely. And they also have Pierre Strong in their backfield as well, the rookie out of North Dakota. But basically, I wrote an article about Rhamondre Stevenson on PFF.com. Make sure to check that out. But historically, the Patriots really do not like using rookie running backs on third down. Basically, since 2006 in the PFF era, Lawrence Maroney has the most snaps on third and three or longer, and that's only 45 snaps throughout an entire season. So probably don't expect to see a lot of Pierre Strong on third down if he does wind up playing. But the Patriots have built up confidence in Rhamondre Stevenson on third down. Basically, like I said, what I've heard is that he's expected to get a chance to fill that role that Ty Montgomery was filling before. Definitely a different body type for Rhamondre Stevenson as well. But what have you seen from him as a pass catcher in general?
There hasn't really been all that much over the 2 years that we have. He was barely used as a receiver in week one. If anything, Damian Harris ran more pass routes, even though he only caught 2 passes, I think, in that game as well. So we haven't seen a ton, but based on everything we've seen and from reading your article, he's definitely worked on it a ton over the offseason. So even though we haven't seen it a lot, we know he's likely improved from year one to year two, and we just haven't had a chance to see it in year two yet.
Definitely. And James White, who's now retired, has even been working with Rhamondre Stevenson a little bit as well. Let's talk a little bit about last night's game between the Chiefs and the Chargers. This Chiefs wide receiver core is a little bit similar to what we were just talking about with the Patriots running back core. Who's the guy for you, fantasy wise, that you want as a Chiefs receiver, obviously beyond Travis Kelce?
It probably still is Juju Smith-Schuster, just from seeing what he's done in the past, and compared to someone like McCole Hardman, who's still third on the depth chart, at least in terms of how they're using them so far, and Marquez Valdes-Scantling, we haven't seen a ton out of him, both in Green Bay and Kansas City, and I would only expect their playing time to decrease as the season progresses. We saw Justin Watson see a little bit more time in the third quarter in particular, and all he did is catch a 41-yard touchdown pass and then another catch in the game. So he's probably looked the best out of the Kansas City receivers in that game. And then Sky Moore was just used for the kneel down, so that's a little surprising, but would guess they try to get him at least a little bit more involved as the season goes on. So I could definitely see like a 5-man rotation out of Kansas City going forward, which they were doing a little bit last year, and just makes it a complicated situation.
Chiefs definitely have, I'd say, better depth at wide receiver certainly this season than they have in years past. But it is tough to not have that top end talent like they had in Tyreek Hill. And Patrick Mahomes' play is maybe dropped off a little bit early this season. He got pretty fortunate in that game yesterday.
Yeah.
Had some dropped interceptions in there. So the Chiefs are still winning, but you might be seeing, I don't know if it's regression, but he has not been playing quite as well without Tyreek Hill on the field, at least early in the season. For the Chargers, were there any major fantasy takeaways for you last night from the Chargers?
Josh Palmer was someone who saw more playing time with Keenan Allen out, but I expect him, even once Allen is back, to continue to see playing time. His stats weren't huge in the game, although certainly helped right at the end of the game with a nice catch. But there were a couple passes where Justin Herbert just wasn't accurate and Palmer was open. Another defensive pass interference. So the statistics definitely could have been a lot higher in this game. So he's someone that I wouldn't mind just trying to trade for because his stats weren't great and someone might be concerned with Allen coming back. And then their tight end, Everett, he had a fairly good game, but I also know Donald Parham could be coming back at some time, and Trey McKitty was cutting into his playing time throughout the game. And being a young former third-round pick, I expect McKitty to potentially see more time as the season goes on. So Everett's someone that I would probably be interested in trading at this point.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, Gerald Everett has looked pretty spry, I'd say, in the first couple of weeks of the season, but he also had I guess it wasn't necessarily a mistake on his part. He was just kind of tired out there after catching a few passes, but the Justin Herbert pick six was kind of on Gerald Everett for not running a little bit of a tighter route on that play. But what do you think about Mike Williams going forward as well? He actually had kind of a bounce back game, had a big first half, didn't do quite as much in the second half of that game.
He's someone that I think I'm probably still keeping in my starting lineup each week, just knowing that there's going to be a couple weeks where he's not going to put up that great of numbers since he hasn't been the most consistent receiver. But then, like we saw in the first half of this game, he can make catch after catch after catch, some of them pretty exciting catches to make, and those stats will pile up in some games. So he'll definitely help you win some games, but then there'll also be some games throughout the fantasy season where you'll be a little disappointed.
Certainly. Right before we started the show, news got out that George Kittle, the 49ers tight end, returned to practice on Friday. This seems like we're probably heading for a questionable tag on George Kittle. You probably know that by the time this show comes out anyway, but what do you do in this situation? Obviously, you've probably got to get some insurance on your roster, but are there any names that people who have Kittle should be picking up, or what do you do in this situation?
Sure. Definitely keep your ears open to what happens between now and then and how confident they are, and FP might be on a pitch count and those kinds of things. If you are looking to pick someone up, ideally you've already had because you had to do it in week one, but Albert O in Denver is probably the best option that's still available in a ton of leagues. He was used only situationally in Denver, seeing a lot more snaps in 11 personnel, not playing so much in two tight end sets or other more run-heavy formations, which isn't ideal for a starting fantasy tight end. But if you're getting someone off the waiver wire, he did catch a couple passes. And then another option, Logan Thomas in Washington. He's available in even more leagues, coming back from injury, so they didn't use him as much as they typically do in week one. But I could see his usage increasing a little bit in week two against the Lions.
I was a little surprised in that Broncos-Seahawks game to see both teams really targeting tight ends as much as they did. And Russell Wilson did seem to be leaning on those tight ends. We saw Andrew Beck catch a couple passes early in the game. Then he barely played after that. So I'd say that, just the fact that he was throwing to tight ends as much, probably a good sign for Albert O. I was gonna try to do it. I'll just go with Albert O. For a while there, I could nail the last name, but not anymore. Let's talk about the Buccaneers Saints game, because there are a ton of injuries in this one. Probably the most impactful, the one that's toughest to predict right now, Alvin Kamara. He did not practice on Thursday or Friday, but he got that official questionable tag here. So I'm basically going to pose the same question as I did with George Kittle. What do you do in this situation? Who are some running backs that Alvin Kamara managers should be looking to grab?
Sure. First, I'd keep an eye on who is playing, who isn't playing for the Saints, since Mark Ingram also questionable. Dwayne Washington, their third running back, also questionable. So I think Tony Jones or James is their own. Tony Jones is their only healthy running back. So there's a potential of someone there getting a ton of carries. So keep an eye out there. If you're looking for a running back on a different team, Jeff Wilson was picked up on a ton of fantasy teams over these past couple of days, but there's a chance he's still available in your league and he would be the top option. Rex Burkhead in Houston, I don't expect him to see quite as much playing time in week 2 as he did week 1 with Dameon Pierce, hopefully playing a little bit more. But Burkhead should still see all of the passing work, and the Texans should be passing a lot. So he should still see a decent amount of volume. And then Jamal Williams, depending on what happens with the Lions running backs. And if you're really desperate, Kenyon Drake should still see at least a decent amount of playing time, regardless of J.K. Dobbins being healthy or not. So Drake's probably the best option that's available in a significant number of leagues right now.
Yeah, J.K. Dobbins, officially questionable against the Miami Dolphins. He did finally practice in full, but if you're a J.K. Dobbins manager and if he is active in this game, are you playing him? I know we were just talking about the Saints Buccaneers game. We'll get back to that in a second. But with Dobbins, how much confidence would you have if he is actually playing and active in this game?
I would probably rest him just because I know how much the Ravens have rotated running backs in the past in general and have no problem having one guy see 75% of the work and another guy 25%. So I would not be surprised whatsoever if they ease him into action. And if he's going well, then I'll see more playing time as the game goes on. But if not, then they could easily ease back his playing time. So because of that uncertainty, I wouldn't be comfortable playing him. But I also know there are some managers where you don't have a better option on your bench anyway, so you're stuck playing him.
Absolutely. Getting back to that Saints-Bucks game, Mike Evans returned to practice. He's questionable. Julio Jones returned to practice. He's questionable. And Chris Godwin out with that hamstring injury. Russell Gage, I think, is also questionable to play in this game. So I think, based on the fact that Evans and Jones returned to practice on Friday, they're probably trending upwards. And what do you think about them as fantasy plays, especially with Chris Godwin out of this game?
I think any of those top 3 that you mentioned, as long as they're playing, I would have them in your starting roster just because the Buccaneers offense can be so good. And as long as you're the one getting the targets, the Saints defense has been good in the past, but I think it's an opportunity to take advantage of. Brashad Perriman, I think their 5th wide receiver, also questionable in this game. So it's not like there's going to be a healthy backup wide receiver that really takes a lot of these snaps or targets away from these star wide receivers as long as they're playing. So I think if you have them on your roster, they're going to see the volume because there's not many other options on the team. Leonard Fournette, I believe, also questionable in the game. So Buccaneers really limited on options. So whoever's playing are going to see plenty of touches.
Lions are playing the Washington Commanders, and running back DeAndre Swift, questionable with an ankle injury. This was an injury he suffered, I believe, during the game and played through it. Did miss some time in practice this week, but usually when you see a guy play through an injury, it's usually a good sign for the next week. The fact that he's questionable to play in this game, but if by any chance he is out, what do you think about Jamal Williams as a fantasy play or anyone else on that Lions roster?
I think Jamal Williams would be an excellent play. DeAndre Swift was out. Williams is someone who probably should be on rosters regardless of the injury, just because the Lions do still like to rotate their running backs plenty and rely on both of them a lot. So Williams should still see plenty of volume throughout the season. And of course, in this situation, if Swift is out, I expect Williams to see a clear majority of the carries and targets, and they rely on the running backs. So he will see enough volume that you definitely would not only want to pick him up, but also start him.
Getting to the Cowboys-Bengals game, both of these teams certainly looking for a bounce back. I think the Bengals have a better shot of a bounce back in this one. But T. Higgins expected to play despite the fact that he suffered a concussion last week. Michael Gallup on the other end for the Cowboys still not expected to play because of the knee injury that he suffered last year. Bengals, I would assume that as long as T. Higgins does play in this game, as long as he's good to go, he's still viewed as a solid fantasy wide receiver too, I would expect moving forward.
Oh, yeah, definitely. When someone has a concussion, typically they're either playing almost to the full extent that they typically do, or they're not playing. There isn't as much in between compared to other injuries. So as long as he's in the starting lineup, definitely comfortable keeping him in your fantasy starting lineup as well.
And as far as the Cowboys go with CeeDee Lamb, clearly there's going to be a drop-off there with Dak Prescott not playing, with Cooper Rush now at quarterback. So how much are you personally dropping a lot of those Cowboys skill position players now with the forced quarterback change due to Dak Prescott's injury?
Particularly the receivers, moving them down the rankings a bit. CeeDee Lamb's still someone who was going to be a top 10 fantasy wide receiver before the injury, so this probably only drops him down to a top 20, maybe top 30, but you're still starting top 30 wide receivers on your roster, so you're still starting him. You're just not going to be quite as happy with the results. And then the running backs, they aren't moved too much in the rankings just because they'll probably rely more on the running backs than they would have before, so more handoffs, more short passes to them, so they'll still see the volume, maybe not quite the same efficiency with that volume, but volume's what matters most in fantasy.
Is there a Cowboys wide receiver? Obviously, we expect Michael Gallup to be back relatively soon since he wasn't placed on injured reserve before the season, but is there another wide receiver in that group that, is a lottery shot play or someone that you'd throw in DFS, or is there just another Cowboys wide receiver that you kind of like?
Like Noah Brown was the clear guy who saw the majority of snaps, saw a number of catches in the game. So if you were doing a single game, daily game, it was fine to have Brown in your lineup. But outside of that, there's too many other wide receivers on different teams with so much upside that if you're doing like a full game or full day contest, probably not looking at any of the other receivers in Dallas.
Michael Pittman is questionable to play against the Jaguars with a quad injury. And then also Alec Pierce, I believe, out with a concussion in this game as well. So, if by some chance Michael Pittman doesn't play, we already know that Alec Pierce is out. What do you make of the Colts wide receiver core? Is there anyone else that you'd be interested there?
I was interested in seeing Ashton Dulin, who was their fourth wide receiver, played pretty well in that first game, saw 6 passes on 14 targets. So that's a huge target share on a small sample size, but caught 3 of them for 46 yards. So definitely a good game out of him. I'm probably not rushing too much to pick him up off the waiver wire right now, unless you're in a larger league where you start a ton of players, but definitely interested in him. But if Pittman doesn't play, for example, and you're looking for a wide receiver off the waiver wire, there are a couple number 2 wide receivers throughout the league that are still pretty readily available. DJ Chark, Sterling Shepard, Zay Jones, all players who will see a ton of playing time, so they should see at least some targets if you're desperate for a wide receiver.
Yeah, I had heard good things about DJ Chark during training camp. One of the beat writers there said that he was looking like a wide receiver 1 in practice. That didn't really translate into week 1, but certainly still a guy who I think has got some upside there in Detroit's offense, despite the fact that Amon-Ra St. Brown has definitely been the target eater there for the Lions. Looking at the Falcons-Rams game, Damian Williams out with a rib injury. I would expect that this would mean a lot more of Cordell Patterson. I was actually kind of surprised that Damian Williams started that game in week 1, but Patterson played really well, so I'd probably expect to see more of him moving forward. But what do you make of this week with Williams out, and then that situation moving forward once Williams does get healthy?
Yeah, I feel like that's one of the more crazy running back situations in the NFL. Throughout the preseason, they were using like 5 different running backs in the first quarter with the starters. So it was pretty clear they didn't know exactly who they wanted to use where and whatnot. So Williams saw the majority of snaps, just not just the start, but over the first 10 plays that he was in, or their first 10 plays, he was in for 8 of them, Patterson 4 of them. So I wouldn't be surprised if Williams is back in a week or so, if he's the starter again and basically splitting time with Patterson. For this week in particular, I still have Patterson as a top 20 running back, so definitely comfortable starting him this week. But I could also see them activating or having Tyler Algier on the active roster, unlike week 1, and him seeing some playing time. And if he plays well in that limited playing time, then it just becomes an even more complicated backfield with 3 players rotating in and out rather than just 2.
Just kind of, I understand this is not on our docket here, but I'm just kind of firing it off at you. Ken Walker does not have an injury designation against the 49ers. Another kind of shaky situation there between him and Rashad Penny. What do you make of that? Which one would you prefer, this week or even moving forward? What's your take on the Seahawks running back situation?
I probably prefer Penny this week and going forward in general, but I think it's a very much a situation to avoid unless Seattle continues to play well like they did on Monday night. But neither one of those 2 backs really plays on third downs or the 2-minute drill. Travis Homer played all of those situations the first week of the season, and Walker in college wasn't a very experienced receiver, and he wasn't in the preseason as well. So I expect Homer to continue to be their third down back the rest of the season and the 2-minute drill back. And if they are losing a lot in games, that means a lot of their third down back and not so much of either of the other two backs. So I think it'll be really hard to trust either Penny or Walker for most of the rest of the season unless they have a good matchup.
Yeah, it is tough because obviously Walker was very highly thought of coming out of Michigan State, and I thought Rashad Penny looked really good in that Week 1 game. He's a very explosive back. I like him a lot as a player, but if it's a timeshare there, plus you throw in the third down back, certainly not a fun situation. Getting into the Cardinals-Raiders game, we've got Rondale Moore out again with a hamstring injury. The Cardinals are just kind of trying to weather the storm here at wide receiver, it feels like, until DeAndre Hopkins comes back. But beyond Marquise Brown, is there anyone on that roster that is interesting to you at wide receiver? And is Marquise Brown potentially the type of guy that, he might go off early in the season here with some of these injuries and suspensions? And is he a guy that you would consider trading if that does happen?
Oh, yeah, I think I'd definitely be happy to start him right now with the how few wide receivers Arizona has healthy, and someone that if he does well, once more of these wide receivers come back, he probably won't do quite as well. Greg Dortch, I think is how you pronounce his last name. He saw plenty of work in the slot with Moore out and put up some pretty good numbers. So there's certainly a chance that he can do it again. It was something where I wasn't sure if I should feel better about Moore or worse about Moore that Arizona was so willing to throw to their slot receiver in Week 1, even though it wasn't Moore, or if this is a sign that Moore might not see as much playing time as we like, because Greg Dortch could see some playing time even when Moore is healthy. So definitely a fluid situation. And like in very deep leagues, Dortch is someone that you could consider, especially in DFS, someone who could do well. But definitely a situation to keep an eye on going forward.
Yeah, Cliff Kingsbury said really as far back as the Combine that they wanted to get Rondale Moore, heavily involved in the offense, but then they add Marquise Brown. Rondale Moore starts the season off with this injury. It's certainly a tough situation for him to start the year. Let's talk about the Giants and the Panthers. Giants dealing with some injuries right now at wide receiver. Wan'Dale Robinson out with a knee injury. That's unfortunate since he did start in Week 1. Looked like he was going to play a big role early in the season here. And then Kadarius Toney, questionable with a hamstring injury. He barely played in general in Week 1. Now this injury pops up. So you mentioned Sterling Shepard earlier. What are your expectations out of Shepard and that Giants wide receiver core as a whole?
I would probably expect Shepard to lead the team in routes, lead the team in targets. So just from volume alone, I think that's why I'm comfortable with him, is because New York doesn't really have all that many other options. Kenny Galladay is there, but he hasn't really done as much recently. David Stills will continue to rotate in on the outside with Richie James playing in the slot, but I'm not all that excited about Richie James or David Stills, considering how low they were on the depth chart not all that long ago. So I think all of this probably just leads to Saquon Barkley getting more and more touches, because with how well he played in Week 1, might as well give your best player the ball as much as you can. So I think this mostly just means more good news for Saquon Barkley, but Shepard's someone who should definitely see some volume and probably won't win you your league Week 2, but he probably also won't lose your matchup.
David Stills is interesting to me, if only for one reason, and that's, I forgot who was talking about this recently. I think it might have been on the Manning cast or something, but when certain wide receivers kind of glom onto their quarterback and become very close to them, sometimes that results in an uptick in targets and catches. We saw it with Cooper Kupp last year with the Los Angeles Rams. And Daniel Jones and David Stills are very close. I think that David Stills is the guy that he throws to the most during the offseason. I think that they're pals. But until David Stills actually gets on the field and gets considerable snaps, then yes, obviously an unpredictable situation there. But if David Stills does ever actually, get into a starting role, if injuries get down to that point, you might see a decent connection there between Daniel Jones and David Stills just for that reason. Let's talk a little bit about the Steelers and the Patriots. Mac Jones back at practice, good to go against the Steelers. That's good. There was kind of a scary back injury in week 1 for him. Then he also had an illness, a stomach bug of some sort on Thursday, but he was back at practice on Friday. Najee Harris on the other side of the ball for the Steelers, good to go despite a foot injury. It seemed a little concerning about Najee Harris early in the week. So is that kind of a pleasant surprise now at this point that Najee seems good to go?
Yeah, that's definitely good to see. He's someone that you'll want in your starting lineup. I know he had a little bit of a disappointing week 1, and the offensive line still isn't really doing him any favors. So that's kind of disappointing to fantasy managers as well. But Harris is still someone who should consistently see enough volume that just from volume alone, you want him in your fantasy starting lineups.
As far as the Steelers wide receiver situation goes, obviously Deontay Johnson was kind of the big winner of week 1, but do you still think that there's a possibility that George Pickens could play a big role this season? Bill Belichick was throwing out high praise about Chase Claypool today. I think he compared him to Rob Gronkowski, which kind of came out of left field. But do you see that being an unpredictable situation, or is Johnson just the guy there?
I think it's a little bit unpredictable in that we could see, I think it'll be really matchup based from one week to another, since all 3 of those guys will continue to see playing time. They play a ton of 3 wide receiver sets, and they weren't rotating a ton at wide receivers. So all 3 of them definitely saw significant playing time, ran significant routes. So I think matchups will dictate a lot who's the wide receiver that does well each week, with Johnson obviously being the number 1 guy on the team. But if a team's really trying to take him away, then I think the other wide receivers are capable of stepping up and having big games with a lot of targets.
And with the Patriots wide receivers, I know this is another one that I'm just kind of throwing out at you, so I apologize for that.
No problem.
But Jacoby Myers, he's kind of the dependable guy, consistent. Devontae Parker actually led Patriots wide receivers in snaps in week 1. And then you saw Nelson Aguilar kind of mixing in with Jacoby Myers as that number 2/3 wide receiver. Then Kendrick Bourne plays 2 snaps, gets a 41-yard catch, and is taken back out of the game. That's an odd situation where Kendrick Bourne had kind of a weird summer, got into a fight during a joint practice with the Panthers, then missed a meeting, was late to a meeting, so then he didn't play against the Panthers in that preseason game, was back on the field against the Raiders in the 3rd preseason game, but then he's way down the depth chart at this point. Like I said, 2 snaps in week 1, and this is a situation where the Patriots are playing almost half of their snaps in 12 personnel with Jonnu Smith and Hunter Henry on the field together. So those 3rd and 4th wide receivers in New England probably aren't going to get a ton of playing time, not get a lot of targets. But at the same time, I heard this week that Kendrick Bourne is expected to see more playing time. So is it just Jacoby Myers or bust in that Patriots wide receiver room, or is there another guy that you kind of like? And I'd actually throw the tight ends in there as well.
Yeah, I feel like Jacoby Myers is the only one I trust, since he also is the one who often plays in the slot. And historically, the Patriots slot receivers have done a fantastic job. Myers saw plenty high target share last year when he lined up in the slot. It just wasn't always the most accurate passes thrown his way. So I think he's capable of playing as well as some of the wide receivers in the Patriots past. But outside of that, I think Parker will continue to see playing time, and eventually he might develop more chemistry with Jones. So if that happens, there's definitely a possibility. But I'm definitely interested in seeing F. Bourne plays more this week or going forward, as well as the rookie Thornton once he gets healthy. If that decreases the amount of two tight end sets that they use, and when they do decrease the amount of 2 tight end sets, if that means Henry's off the field more, because it does seem like they trust Jonnu Smith more this year as a receiver than they did last year. So I think that just definitely complicates the situation. Henry's someone that I might be interested in trading in fantasy football right now, just because there's all these factors that could lead to him eventually seeing a little bit less playing time or see a little bit fewer targets. So I think it's really just Myers that I trust at this point.
Yeah, I covered the Patriots for a number of years for Nesson before I came over here to PFF. And so I'm kind of tied in with that organization a little bit. On that tight end situation, basically sounded like Jonnu Smith kind of found himself in Josh McDaniels' doghouse a little bit last year, and that was one of the reasons why he didn't play as much. But then we heard all this news about the new offense that the Patriots had implemented this year, and one of the things I heard about that was that it would help Nelson Agholor play a little bit faster and also help Jonnu Smith play a little bit faster. Nelson Agholor had a big fumble in week 1, so maybe things aren't starting off so hot for him. But yeah, Jonnu Smith did definitely look a little bit more comfortable in the offense. It looked like Mac Jones was a little bit more willing to throw to him. Also, if you're just comparing Hunter Henry and Jonnu Smith is really more of that inline guy. That might surprise some people because he's also probably the better athlete than Hunter Henry. But based on the way that those guys were used last year, Jonnu Smith was really more of the inline guy. Hunter Henry was a little bit more of the flex option. So if they do go into 11 personnel where they're still looking to run the ball, it might wind up being Jonnu Smith getting more of those snaps. Before I let you go, Nathan, let's talk about one more matchup. That's the Titans and the Bills. Dontrell Hilliard had a massive week 1 scoring-wise with 2 touchdowns, but he kind of barely played in that game, and now he's been out of practice for 2 straight days with a DNP. If he's a guy that someone picked up on the waiver wire, clearly if he's out of this game, like, is he a guy that you would just immediately drop and try to pick someone else up?
Yeah, it very much depends on the league because I could see Hilliard seeing significant playing time if Derrick Henry ever gets hurt at some point this season. So if you're in a league where a lot of backup running backs are on rosters, then I'm fine keeping him. But definitely he's probably not someone that you need on your roster if you're in a smaller league or with lighter benches. But I'll be curious to see what they do this week. If it's Hassan Haskins getting that third down work, I know at one point in the preseason, they were using their fullback, Torrey Carter, on third down. So probably doesn't matter too much one way or another for fantasy, but I would be curious to see how Haskins does if he gets a little bit more playing time.
I did want to also ask you about one other player on the Titans, and that is wide receiver Kyle Phillips. He missed practice on Thursday. He was back at practice on Friday. That game is on Monday night, so certainly still time for him to practice again on Saturday before that game. But based on what I was hearing before the season, there were some people around the league who thought that Kyle Phillips would wind up leading the Titans in receptions this season, and he had a pretty productive week 1. What do you think about Kyle Phillips moving forward?
He's someone that I definitely want on my bench and my fantasy rosters just to see what he does over these next couple weeks, assuming he's healthy. But like throughout the preseason, Tennessee was rotating 6 or 7 guys at outside receiver trying to figure out what they were doing there. But then he was always in the slot and 3 wide receiver sets. So it seemed like he was the one player that they were knew what they wanted to do with, and that continued to be the case in week 1. He had plenty of targets, a number of catches, which is really good to see out of a rookie in their first NFL game. So it's a little difficult just because he's only playing in 3 wide receiver sets on a team that likes to run the ball a lot. And if they're winning, then it's probably a case where he won't be on the field too much, but especially in matchups where Tennessee might be a little bit behind, he's someone that I could very well see him being in fantasy starting lineups by mid-season in the right matchups.
Kyle Phillips, a 5th-round pick out of UCLA. Certainly a possibility that he actually winds up outproducing Treylon Burks, who was a 1st-round pick for the Tennessee Titans, expected to take over that role for A.J. Brown. But here's another guy who had kind of a shaky summer and offseason in general with Tennessee. That will do it for today's PFF Wire. Thank you so much, Nathan Jahnke, for joining me, replacing Brad Spielberger here on Friday's show. Throw Nathan a follow at PFF_Nathan Jahnke on Twitter. Throw me a follow at Doug Kyed. Keep it on PFF.com for all of your news and analysis. Download the PFF app. Make sure to subscribe to PFF Plus, only $80 annually right now. So a great time to subscribe to PFF. Also subscribe to the PFF Wire podcast if you want to listen to this on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And we will see you guys again on Monday.